Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Sloan. I'm the VP of Cybersecurity Advocacy at Zscaler, and I have the pleasure of hosting this special briefing today. And now most of you on the webinar will have a role in cybersecurity and/or risk management. Others on the webinar may have oversight of or accountability for cyber and risk in your organizations. What tends to concern leaders in these roles are the threats and risks we hear the most about, those that are most visible at any one time. So in recent times, that's been devastating ransomware attacks that lock up systems, or the theft of intellectual property by nation-state hackers, or complying with the latest privacy regulations around the world to avoid massive fines. We don't always think about the mundane things that can cause chaos, though. And so it was on Friday, July 19th, as news of a global outage broke. Planes were grounded, operations were disrupted for banks and retailers and emergency services, working government departments around the world ground to a halt, and it turned out not to be any sort of sophisticated attack, but rather a software update that went awry. Preparing for similar unexpected cloud outages is our topic for the next 45 minutes. Now, to give you an overview of what we're going to be covering, we're going to look at the CrowdStrike outage, understand what happened, whether it can happen again. We're going to look at the other key cloud outage risks, what we need to be concerned about, what the best practices are for disaster recovery and business continuity. We'll briefly look at how Zscaler helps its customers prepare. We'll finish by answering any questions that you may have. So you can ask questions at any time in the chat, any point, put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll put them to our experts at the end of the discussion. So let's take a moment now to meet our experts. Please welcome Patrick Foxhoven, Zscaler's Chief Innovation Officer, and Deepan Desai, Zscaler's Chief Security Officer. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Thanks, Rob.
Good
morning. Lots of questions to get through, so let's get started. Let's start by talking about the CrowdStrike outage. Deepan, can you talk us through what happened with the outage? How did it unfold and what was behind it?
Yeah. So, Rob, at the core of what happened on July 19th was a CrowdStrike Falcon update. CrowdStrike Falcon is their endpoint detection response module, where a signature update, they call it channel file update. This is where they had exploit and C2 signatures getting pushed out. This update triggered a logic bug in their code and at the operating system levels on Windows machines. This update was live for about 79 minutes. The logic bug basically resulted in machines going into this infinite reboot loop. So even after the machine reboots, and this is the core functionality of EDR. A lot of these updates that gets pushed out in order to make sure when the machine boots up, the first thing that happens is the security software, the detections get priority over everything else. And if that itself is faulty, the crash keeps happening again and again. So that's basically what unfolded. This is where any machine, Windows machine that was online during that 79 minutes time frame automatically got that update and resulted in the impact that we saw globally.
And so only affected Windows machines. Were there certain industries or parts of the world that were worse affected?
I mean, we saw airline industry being one that got a huge impact. I mean, it was more visible on their end. There were reports of healthcare, even law enforcement, many other industry verticals where we saw a similar impact.
And your millions of machines affected. How long did it take to start rectifying, to roll back the changes that were made and get people operational again?
It was look, if it was an endpoint that belonged to an employee, you're able to share instructions and have that employee do certain things. I mean, we ourselves had about 300 endpoints. We are a CrowdStrike user. We had to work around the clock. It was a war room situation where working with the employee, the IT team, providing relevant instructions. But imagine those kiosk, the machines, the OT machines, where there is no human assigned to it. So those are the scenarios where it did take days, in some cases weeks, to get the systems back operational.
And Patrick, from what I've seen, I think it's pretty fair to say that CrowdStrike were very transparent about what happened. They came out straight away, said it was their update that had caused this. Have they taken steps to make sure the same thing doesn't happen again? And is there a risk that other software companies could cause the same outage?
Yeah, not to be overly alarming, but I think we would all have a false sense of security if we felt that we were now immune from this kind of a scenario from someone else in the future. I think these kinds of incidents, and this in particular was, while very impactful, it wasn't a complicated set of multiple things that happened to cause it. I mean, there were multiple failures within, I think, process to cause this to happen. But we can see also events where there's multiple external factors or other third parties that go in that complicate things even more. So I mean, on the spectrum of what could go wrong, this was not completely crazy or unprecedented. So I do think we have to be paranoid and not relax and not have that false sense of security, because this very much could happen in other ways and other scenarios. And the spectrum of things that could go wrong, I mean, we're talking about change management and how you release things to production environments, and there's lots of insight that you can gain from what went wrong here. But in the spectrum of what else could go wrong, I think you have to be thinking about things in the categories that I like to think about. What should a customer demand from any service that is mission critical? There's four buckets that I think is important to cover the spectrum. You have to think about capacity. Does the service have enough capacity to handle your your need or your use case? You have to worry about availability. Is it up or down? And availability can be one part of the equation, but the third bucket is performance. I think the performance of a solution is also equally important, because something could be up but not performing well, and that can be even more impactful than if it was down altogether from having an impact to business. And then the security of the overall solution as well. Those four things: capacity, availability, performance, security. You have to look at the entire spectrum of things that could cause these kind of catastrophic like events. So in short, Rob, to your question, no, I don't think we're immune, or we're past, or never we'll see this again. In fact, even in this particular realm, client-side security software, we've seen this even in the last decade, of reduced scale, just because of how pervasive interconnectivity and systems and so forth are today compared to, we saw an incident like this happen in 2012, without beating up vendors, but a very similar scenario happened in 2012, reduced impact, but very similar kind of change that caused the very similar kind of destruction in a company's network.
And so that's a good point, because this would have had a much reduced effect. We may not have even heard about some of these incidents a few years ago, because our reliance on cloud was so much less. Looking forward then into the next 5-10 years, as cloud becomes ever more pervasive, are we likely to see more incidents? Is the disruption likely to be greater?
Potential impact, absolutely, as we become more hyper interconnected and more things and devices, and everything is connecting to the network, and the network is really the corporate internet, or the corporate network is really becoming the internet now, in that kind of level of hyper interconnectivity. I think the potential is there to be even more impactful. I would hope, I'll not just be too alarmist, as as someone that's responsible within our company for some of these areas. I think hopefully we also evolve as an industry in terms of providing more resilient systems that have failure scenarios baked in by design, because nothing is ever going to be perfect, and we hold to processes around change releases and canarying. And I know we'll probably cover a couple of those points in a little bit, but I hope we get better as an industry too, as these things get more interconnected.
And you mentioned canarying there, which I quite like that term. You mind just explaining that in case there's folks on the call that don't understand it?
Yeah. So the concept is when you are one of the most risky things you can do in IT is make a change, as I'm sure everyone knows. So when you do need to implement a change, the concept of canarying is implement that change in a small way, uh, in a small area, and observe it over time to make sure that things perform well, that you don't have any adverse effects from that change being introduced, and then continue to roll that out in more phases or larger canarying or however you want to call it. It's just the core concept of introducing a change slowly and never doing an all at once to everyone like scenario that we saw in this incident. That's one of the most risky things you can do because again, nothing's ever going to be perfect.
Deep, I imagine you spend a lot of time thinking about what could go wrong. What are some of the worst case scenarios for cloud outages that you've thought about that could happen to our company, and how prepared is the average company to respond?
Yeah. Look, when you think about different ways in which an incident similar to what we observed last month can happen, software update is just one vector. We have seen cases of malicious insider or outsider across the industry where a human with malicious intent can do certain things that can result in a global outage. So all organizations must at this stage have that insider threat program where they're taking steps to identify, mitigate, and above everything else, reduce the risk from a malicious insider. There are a few other scenarios that obviously every organization should think about. There is always the possibility of a natural disaster. Geopolitical situation can also increase risk when you're operating in certain regions. So yeah, and of course, finally, being a CISO, cyber events, cyber attacks are always top of mind as well, which could result in a cloud outage, and you should have a proper incident response, business continuity, and disaster recovery plans to handle each of this.
And I know I've recently been reading a lot of the 8K disclosures from companies that have been affected by cyber attacks. One of the things I've seen regularly mentioned is the disruption that's followed a ransom attack. The outages has not been from the attackers, but rather from the companies responding to the attack and trying to limit the damage. So these disruptions can also be self-inflicted.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
think.
So,
Sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Deepan. Please go.
Yeah, no, the point I would make over there is that basically warrants why it is important to prepare for such scenarios because you will otherwise you may have the perfect policy document, perfect incident response plan, but unless you practice that, either doing tabletop exercises, um, you will end up making certain decisions when you're under that pressure, under that stress situation, and resulting in unintended outcomes.
Right, that's a nice segue then through from what might happen and what has happened to how do we start thinking about what we should do about it. And not all outages are going to be equally problematic. So how do we assess which ones?
Yeah, no. So look, you should everything in our world, in the IT world, should involve risk assessment. The decisions that you make should be driven by those risks. When it comes to let's take specific examples because we're talking about an important um, area where we all the organizations suffer, which was an EDR causing the outage. So any platform, any services which fall in that critical services bucket, Zscaler, for instance, is a critical service because we're connecting point A to point B, and we need to make sure we're resilient. It's very, very important. So organizations should look at the stack. At the bare minimum, here are the three things that I think they should absolutely look at. One is their endpoint security solution, another is their identity solution, and the third one is where their zero trust architecture solution like Zscaler comes into play. Do they have proper resiliency configured? Do they have plans to recover if something bad like what happened in July were to happen in any of those areas, right? These are critical areas for them to function and be operational. And then you should look at, of course, your business critical apps that you need to stay productive internally. Also, the apps that your customers rely on. Every organization, depending on the industry vertical they are in, will have a different set of apps, or even in certain cases, OT, IoT systems that are driven by those apps that needs to be looked at.
And Patrick, I imagine it's not just one standard playbook for the response, is it? I imagine planning for a short outage, whether that's minutes or hours, varies a lot from planning from being without an application or a service for days or weeks. So how do you think of it, of the time of the duration as a factor for how you determine the response?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it goes without saying that you have to categorize what is, you have to categorize what's mission critical, what applications are must have, what are nice to have. So you have to categorize it into those buckets so that then how you recover from an incident, the time of that, how long that takes, we'll go into that as a factor. I think what we saw with this event in particular is, we know the core root cause of what caused the incident, but then the cascading processes downstream on how you recover from that vary greatly. And I think that's why you see particular organizations a lot more impacted than others, is because they might have had more of a plan in place or more control or a grasp of how do you recover from different scenarios. I mean, this recovery required something that is kind of crazy that you have to worry about in 2024, which is you have to send a person with a keyboard and a mouse to plug into that machine and literally type in commands on a console or a terminal to recover from it. I mean, that's a scenario that if you haven't tabletopped before or at least thought of, and you have all these machines everywhere in the world or in ceilings or in all kinds of different kiosks and different scenarios, obviously those companies were a lot more impacted than others that might have had more automation in play that might have been able to help recover from it. So I think you have to look at it in a pragmatic way. You can't do disaster recovery planning like the way it's been done in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s, which is we're just going to replicate everything in this complete new site and we're going to have a lights off on the old and lights on the new, and that kind of DR mentality you can't do anymore. You have to look at it more holistically and more pragmatically, because that's not going to be feasible. You're not going to do that kind of a incident recovery when you have one application go down. So it has to be done in more of a spectrum.
And deep, a lot of this will go back to the point at which you're procuring a new cloud service. So what key factors should buyers be considering when they're evaluating cloud service providers' disaster recovery capabilities?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important that you pay attention to some of the architectural choices that the vendor that you are relying on, or that you're about to make a purchase decision. The architectural choices, the operational resilience measures that the company has in place. Because what the recent incident signifies is, yes, there may be multiple vendors that are able to deliver a specific service. And I'm not trying to take a dig at a specific vendor from July, but in general, for any of the areas, even the three areas that I described earlier, identity, zero trust architecture, you will see several vendors claiming to do it all. But if the architecture is not built in a way that makes the overall offering resilient, when things like what we saw last month happens, the impact is significant, and it will result in huge business impacts for the organization that make that choices of implementing those vendor solutions without paying attention to how or what that business continuity disaster recovery plan would look like if that vendor has a bad day. So this is where, as part of your purchase decision, in addition to paying attention to the features and modules that they're offering, you should take a look at what that disaster recovery business continuity plan would look like. How quickly can you recover from an incident involving that vendor? And look, in certain situations, this is difficult, right? You can't have, I mean, you can, but you can't have in certain scenarios uh, two vendors delivering the same service. And you can say, when vendor A has a bad day, I'll switch to vendor B because it's operationally not feasible for your IT team to implement. So in those cases, you really have to dig deep on that vendor A, the only vendor you're choosing to deliver that service, to make sure their architecture, their resiliency plans are top notch.
So look past the features, look past the cost, and make sure you understand the architecture and how well built this product is, how well it's going, how resilient it's going to be.
Yeah.
Patrick, responsibility for disaster recovery, yeah, there's an element that lies with the cloud service provider, but there's also an element that lies with the customer. What do the two responsibilities look like? How do they divide up?
Yeah, I think as a service provider, well, no, actually, let me start from a customer. As a customer, you need to be holding your service provider to certain levels of accountability, transparency, and resiliency. Like it's your job to make sure that they are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And you can look to third-party accreditations, although I'll caveat that with lots of vendors now can get lots of accreditations and certifications. But in fact, any good vendor will show you all the same logos. But taking it a step deeper and understanding the architecture, like Deepan was just alluding to, and maybe keeping that bar exceptionally high and looking at certain key accreditations that are really important that are not as easy to get with just checkbox compliance. I think you have to be doing those kinds of things to hold the vendor accountable. And then the second part to your question, Rob, is I think it's you have to realize that no one service can be too big to fail or too important to fail. And you have to realize that there will be catastrophic events that no matter what amount of due diligence you've put a provider through, you have to still be in control of your own destiny for at least the things that are mission critical. So implementing some form of disaster recovery or business continuity that you're in control of, I think is really important as well. And by you're in control, I mean, you're not relying on the vendors DR capability or plans, but you have an option that you are in, you're the pilot of, so to say. You can turn on and off yourself. At least not for everything. I'm not saying you have to, no one can afford to have 100% parity on, not one service, but two, but at least for the things that are business critical, I think it's inevitable. You have to have that in place. And so that'll be different depending on, what keeps a business up and running or an organization healthy or not. So that spectrum of things will change, but and it may not include everything. Like, for example, I was talking to a customer last week, and email, while it's very important, wasn't necessarily deemed mission critical for their organization. So they don't need a totally independent DR catastrophic implementation of an email service, but they do need that for a particular ERP system that they have in place, because factories will stop if that's unavailable. So that made that spectrum may be totally different for different organizations. So the answer is it depends, but I think the two things you have to do, Rob, is hold the vendor accountable. That's your job, and do the due diligence required. And then two, always have a backup plan, no matter how strong that first option is. Always have a backup plan for the things that are mission critical.
And Deepan, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier around tabletop exercises and preparing, exercising for what could go wrong, what the response is. Well, should companies be doing cloud outage tabletop exercises? Should they be doing those at the operational level as well as the executive and board level? And how should they be prioritized over other common scenarios, such as a ransomware or a loss of PII exercise?
Yeah, no, look, there are a couple things that they can do for making sure they're better prepared for a scenario like what we saw in July. And that's not the only scenario you've seen this year. There have been many other cloud outages as well. So to answer your question, many of the vendors, for instance, we ourselves offer an audit option where the product itself allows these organizations to perform an audit uh, on how prepared they are when it comes to disaster recovery resiliency. And when it comes to cloud outage tabletop, I would still give preference to specific scenarios like ransomware, where ultimately the impact is similar to an outage situation where a set of systems are unavailable and you're not able to do your business operations. So when it comes to prioritizing, I would prioritize those um, events like ransomware, loss of PII for sure for tabletop. But if you have room to do more, yes, at least for the critical vendors in the space that I described earlier as well, identity, your plumbing, zero trust plumbing, your endpoint security, maybe do a joint one where, hey, what if any of these three vendor has a bad day? What does my recovery plan look like?
And Deepan, I'm going to stay with you in thinking about the C-suite and the board. How can technology and security leaders brief the rest of the executive team and the board on the risk from cloud outages and the organization's preparedness? Are there metrics they should be sharing?
Yeah, there are metrics. I mean, there are a couple of them that we personally track as well. There's of course those vendor level SLAs that the vendor will define for how quickly they will take care of things. But you as a business will have these two important metrics that are called RTO and RPO, or recovery time objective and recovery point objective. These are both critical components of a business continuity disaster recovery plan that every organization that's running any kind of critical application services must have. Um, for the users at a very high level, RTO, basically recovery time objective, is the maximum amount of time an organization can tolerate being down before it starts to suffer huge consequences. And similarly for the RPO, it's basically the amount of that PII data, the data loss that the organization can suffer, can tolerate in any kind of outage or incident situation.
And Patrick, maybe I can put a similar question to you from another perspective. So if some folks on the call today, they're in non-technology C-suite roles, in board roles, what questions should they be asking of their peers in the IT and security functions to assess the company's preparedness for cloud outages?
Um, it seems very simple, but I think is very impactful. Tried to come up with one question that I think would be important, it's when's the last time you actually tested um, a real world scenario of a, doesn't have to be total disaster, doom and gloom, catastrophic, but of an incident, of a service going down, or of a security event happening, like Deepan was relating to on the tabletop exercises around things like ransomware. Um, Real world proving or testing, I think, is the most important thing, because otherwise it's all academic, or it's we've seen so many times where a organization has a business continuity plan, and when it comes time to actually implement it or action it doesn't happen because it's never been done before. So I think the best artifact is when's the last time you've actually tested it. I think the more mature organizations will, in the Silicon Valley tech space, there's this concept called chaos monkey. It evolved from I think Netflix is the origin of it originally, which is they actually wrote automation or software that would continuously reboot somewhere from 1 to 10% of their infrastructure at all times, all the time. So there's like this continuous level of chaos that's in the environment. I think if an organization has implemented it in a world-class way, they're going to be always proving this out. And it's not going to be just a planned, scheduled, orchestrated event, but it's going to be, there's always, this is the real world. There's always going to be a continuous amount of failure or things going wrong. And if you're continually as continuous as you can test your plans as possible, I think you're going to be far better.
It reminds me of the old Mike Tyson adage of everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So that
Exactly.
continuous testing, continuous chaos, keep the team on their toes so that they're ready when something does go wrong. That's great. But I want to take a few minutes now to talk about Zscaler's approach specifically, how we approach keeping our mission critical applications online and our services reliable. Pat, would you mind maybe just giving a brief overview of Zscaler's mission critical services? Not everyone on the call is going to be familiar with what we offer.
Yeah, I think if you're not familiar with Zscaler, we definitely are delivering a very mission critical service. I like to argue that when a customer deploys a service like ours, we become as critical to the business as, say, AT&T was in the 80s, when if you picked up the phone and you didn't have dial tone in that time, it's business is going to stop. It's a mission critical service. When you deploy a service like ours, we sit in line as a gateway to and from the internet across all your users, all your devices, all your locations. And we're not just following those users when they're at home, but we follow them everywhere they go, across whatever location or environment or region, across all the devices that you have. So when there's a hiccup in a service like ours, it's incredibly impactful. And we had to adopt a mentality of, when anything goes wrong, we have to own the issue no matter what, because we're going to be always the first point of contact. And even if it's not our ultimate root problem, we have to own it and have a mentality of almost, how can we reduce our mean time to innocence as quickly as possible? Because we're going to, when something hiccups on the network or on the internet, we're always going to be the starting point no matter what. And so with that mentality, we've had to do things like Deepan started around talking about around architecture. I kind of see it as a continuous circle. If I was diagramming, I would draw a circle with 5 elements on it. I think the first starts with, high quality, as secure as possible, bug-free code. So a good software development lifecycle, because that's what's delivering our solution in the end. And if you don't do that from the beginning, all the things you do downstream can have ramifications or impacts. So like all the other goodness that you can do down the line, if you don't start with something as secure and as bug-free as possible, you have massive implications downstream. And that's what we saw with like SolarWinds just a few years ago, and what happens if the SDLC cycle is compromised. And then you have to, when you're introducing that software to the service, you have to have staggered deployments, the canarying concepts, or being able to roll back. You have to have processes in place that are never circumvented, that you introduce things in phases slowly and can back out as needed. I think because you can never be so arrogant to think that everything's going to work all the time. And so you have to have that in place. And then you follow that up with, we have teams of people that are responsible for not just the monitoring of the environment, but then the more macro level, when something does go wrong, how can we improve that in the future? And concepts like site reliability engineering and processes around that. I think that's just as important as having high quality code from the beginning. And then last but not least, when there is an incident, having the process in place in terms of how you manage that. I think transparency is key. I think that's something we saw in this incident that was very important, because, when something goes catastrophically wrong, understanding as close to real time as possible what the issue is, how long it's going to be, or how do you roll back, or even which vendor is at fault, being as transparent about that as possible, I think, is really important. And so that also means, like, when you have an incident, not putting that behind a username and a password. I think that's a mentality we've had from day one, which is, our portal that we release to our customers that say how things are going. what's up and down is never been behind a username and a password. I think that commitment to transparency is so important.
Deepan, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, a couple things that I'll mention over here. Patrick touched upon the SDLC aspect, the transparency aspect. Very, very important. That goes back to what I was saying earlier around the vendor needs to have that operational resilience. The architectural choices that they've made should be important. That's where the whole staggering piece comes in. In our world, in Zscaler world, if I were to look at, hey, what are the changes that we do on a daily basis, several times a day at times, right? There are three buckets that we think of. One is where we have an agent which is running on the endpoints that we're updating. We never push the update to the customer. It is always a pull, and there are playbooks that we've defined over there as well to make sure if something goes wrong because of a slew of other things that are running on that endpoint, the customers are able to recover. It's not a widespread impact like the one we saw in case of CrowdStrike. Number two is where being a security vendor, just like CrowdStrike, we also have a lot of those signature updates, security feed updates that happen several times a day, at times every few seconds. We leverage the canary mechanism that Patrick mentioned, the staggered update. There are different types of intelligence feeds that goes into the product. Some require additional rigorous testing. Some require some level of monitoring as well. But the overarching point is where you're not just blasting thousands of global nodes that are responsible for applying those detections on your customers' traffic. So there is staggering over there, there is monitoring, and there is ability to quickly recover if there is any problem that we see in any of these updates. So very important to have those as part of your architectural choices to make sure you're able to deliver a resilient service.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I want to move to some of the audience questions that have come in while we've been talking. I'm going to start with one that's just come in actually from Emily. Thank you, Emily, for your question. I am working with many companies who do not see the need for business continuity planning. Totally recognize everything you're saying, but cannot convince others to do the same. Do you have any advice? Patrick, any advice for Emily in convincing companies of the necessity for business continuity planning? Or do some companies just need to feel the pain of something going wrong before they're convinced?
Unfortunately, the latter is always true, no matter what. But if I was trying to be a little more optimistic about that, I think sometimes when you go about this planning or this this process around how do I implement disaster recovery or business continuity in my organization, sometimes it ends up leading you down a path that ends up being so complex that it becomes unachievable, or it's a problem that's just too complicated to solve or that you care to solve. And I think one of the things I would suggest maybe you could do, Emily, is try to advocate not the need for the process, but advocate how it can be feasibly or realistically implemented. Like I mentioned in an earlier point, I think it doesn't have to be this catastrophic monolithic site is online and now we're all reporting to a new office building and we've activated a DR and it's this huge thing that happens. It can be much more achievable with like a particular service, like for example, Zscaler. We offer we knew that it was complicated to think about how to design a totally separate service like ours and be able to implement it. So we actually productized a disaster recovery product ourselves to back up our own service. So even if all the things we say we should do, we're doing, in the event that there is still something unforeseen or unplanned or something catastrophic, we allow customers to implement on their own. They're in control of a policy that activates a DR service that is on completely separated or independent infrastructure that sometimes is even controlled by them, by the customer. And It's something that they can do selectively for even just a group of users. They don't have to impact everyone all at once. And so I think having the mindset of this is how you can achieve it, and it's achievable without being such a huge, overcomplicated, crazy problem that you can't even fathom, I think is a big part of the advocacy that we can be doing. And that's, again, very different than just philosophically saying you should have disaster recovery.
Deepan, do you think you could also sell it to Emily's customers as a business differentiator, something that becomes a feature of their product, that they have this business continuity planning that maybe some of their competitors don't have?
100%. I mean, look, um, especially after all the news cycle, we're still seeing some of the coverage for Microsoft Azure and CrowdStrike related incident. Um, Having a vendor that offers features like what Patrick just described, where out of the box, the vendor themselves are saying, hey, we will do everything we claim to do on our end, but in the event of that disaster situation, here are the features that we have baked into the product itself, which allows you to switch to an alternate infrastructure. I think that's brilliant, right? That's where you are making an investment in a solution that also gets you ready with your BCP-DR plan. And then in our world, when we think of disaster or failure scenarios, and this is true for all cloud-based or IT solutions, and there is a blackout situation where it's a region or a data center going down. There's a brownout situation, which are usually tough because nothing is really offline, but there's slowness. And then there is these catastrophic failures, which is what we're all talking about right now, where something is completely down and it's all at once. We're seeing it across the board, like we saw with this not malicious, the faulty updates that resulted in the endpoints going down. So in case of those catastrophic failures, what does the vendor themselves offer for you to get back operational? So yeah, I would definitely use that as a point to convince your finance or procurement or the organization to make that investment.
And there's comment, I mean, you may see a comment in the chat from Alan, says start small, maybe just one department, HR or finance, good place to start. Get buy-in from senior leadership, CEO, board level. They have the broader business impact understanding. So plenty of good advice. Good luck with that. I have a couple of minutes left, so I want to try and get another couple of questions in. I have one from Jonathan here. Deepan, I'll put this one to you. If a large part of my IT stack is from the same vendor, am I more or less likely to be affected by outages? So is working with one vendor advantageous or might it be disadvantageous?
Yeah. So trick question, but I'll try to respond to this in a way, the way I would recommend you guys to think about it, right? So, quick advice is yes, you should never put all your eggs in one basket, specifically when it comes to mission critical services. So, an example that I spoke about earlier, think of these three key functions of implementing zero trust architecture in your environment. So, there is this identity provider, the endpoint security provider, and then there is the zero trust plumbing, just like Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange. And then on top of that, you also have several of these application providers, whether it's, I'm talking about the SaaS applications, whether it's Microsoft, ServiceNow, Azure, SAP. I would always make sure that I'm not relying on a single vendor to deliver all of these mission critical services, these key functions of zero trust. I would rely on best of breed platforms in each of these three areas. So a vendor for EDR, a vendor for identity, a vendor for that zero trust plumbing, zero trust exchange, and a separate vendor for the applications. Because when you rely on the same vendor to deliver all of this, if that vendor has a bad day, it's going to be a very, very high impact, disastrous situation for the organization that made that choice. So stagger it even in your vendor choices.
And I'm going to do one last question here, one from Sanjay. How do you convince the finance or procurement team that a more expensive product is with more robust reliability is worth the investment? So, Patrick, a question about weighing the value of reliability. What is it worth?
It's kind of a hard question. I think cost or price doesn't always equate value, and it definitely doesn't equate how available or reliable that service could be. So I don't know if I would necessarily draw the correlation between the cost of a service and and anything related to the resiliency. Usually in the IT world, obviously, the more expensive a service is, the more if a business is willing to invest in that, that's the more important it is. So there is maybe that inherent importance that's equated there. But I don't. That's a harder question to answer because I don't think there's a direct correlation there.
No, but particularly when it's supporting mission critical apps, it may be worth considering reliability over feature set or cost.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Well, look, we're coming right to the end of our time. I want to thank our speakers, Patrick and Deepan, for sharing their insights. Thank you both. Really appreciate that. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And a reminder that if you have any further questions or want to talk more about anything that you've heard today, you can email any of us. My colleagues have posted some links in the chat to Zscaler resources you may want to look at. And after we sign off, you will see a survey. If you have a minute before you leave the webinar, we'd love to hear your feedback. Really helps us refine these future webinars. Thank you so much for joining and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.